Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. We have a big topic for you tonight, universal credit, but not just universal credit, the history of what's happened with that, a journey through, I think, disaster to recovery and possibly on to success as it goes through British government. But we also wanted, and we've got a great panel with us tonight, to think about the lessons coming out of the experience of UC for the other challenges that face government, and thinking about things going forward. What do we learn? What do we do? What might we do differently? What actually do you have to do the same way to get projects of this scale off the ground in the complex environment that is a modern government? So we'll go through this evening working our way through a reasonably structured introduction and then throw it open to the floor. We'll start with Nick's talking about his really great piece of work for us, looking at the history of universal credit, looking through the lens of different perspectives, different people looking at the same set of events. You'll find when you go through that, and Nick I'm sure will bring this out, there are different viewpoints that people hold over the same events. And I think it's fair to say that what we're not saying is there's one objective truth here. There are many different ways of seeing these sort of complex things, but there are a lot of lessons to be drawn out from looking at it from different sides. And I'm sure when we go through it, there's various faces around the audience I know who were involved in this themselves. We may get some other perspectives contributed to our understanding of what's happened over the years. Then Emma Norris, Programme Director here at the Institute, will talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've drawn from Nick's work and some wider work we've done on major implementation in government. You've got a copy of that short briefing note on your desk, very much looking at some of the lessons that can be learned that might be applied going forward by this government, or indeed any government looking at major change. And then great to have an excellent panel of respondents to Nick and Emma, starting with Lord Freud, who's been with this from the beginning, or possibly even before the beginning in various guises. Has worked as, of course, Minister of State for Welfare Reform at the Department for Work and Pensions, and has been involved, I think, in the shadow role since February 2009 on this, and then obviously continuously in government. I think possibly the only minister still working in the same area since 2010. Of course, David has a much wider career than that outside of the politics and policy world in investment banking, and before that at the Financial Times. And then we have Professor Denise Bauer, who is the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association, and also herself a Professor of Engineering Project Management at the University of Leeds. And drawing on Denise's experiences and just the work of the Major Projects Association in bringing together people from different areas and different experience for its members to really learn from each other. So hopefully we'll learn a lot this evening. And finally, Geoffrey Spence, who many of you will know as the former Chief Executive of Infrastructure UK, which did a lot of the government's infrastructure work and planning work from the Treasury, and has had a number of experiences of government. We were talking earlier, you were saying that he was a knowing person coming in and out of government a couple of times in your career to work on these areas. But again, a career of inside HSBC and currently I think working at Lloyd's on their infrastructure, resources and energy business. So excellent group to take us through the issues. As ever, this is a public event. Everything is on the record. There is a hashtag behind me. I think it's IFGUC. Anyone who can pronounce that word, there are prizes for it. So feel free to tweet as we go through the event. But without any further ado, I'll pass over to Nick to take us through some of your thoughts from your work on universal credit and the publication you put together.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much indeed for coming. But unlike any sort of similar piece of work like this that I've done, I have to start with a big health warning. One kind of so large that you might all just get up and walk out before we've even begun. And it kind of goes like this. Universal credit remains very much a work in progress, and there's a hell of a long way still to go. And partly because of that, many of those most intimately involved, and by that I chiefly mean civil servants, but not only civil servants, felt debarred from talking about it to the likes of me. So it's important to understand that several of those who were approached to help with this felt unable to do so for entirely honourable and understandable reasons, and had they done so, this account would have been different and possibly very different. I guess the second part of the warning is that I, along with many others, felt that at a high level of principle this was a good thing to attempt. That the benefit and tax credit system as it existed in the middle part of the last decade badly needed some simplification. It was close to incomprehensible for its staff, let alone the claimants, and it was really complicated. The things that happened to you when you moved in and out of work and back again got really complicated. I have, however, tried not to let that initial instinct get in the way of the judgments in this study. But it does mean that this can only be a partial account in two senses. One, that I thought there was a good idea buried in this, and partial also in the sense that some key voices are missing. But to try to sum up in a few brief minutes, some 40,000 words, what happened? Well, 3 years ago today, the media was full of the findings from the National Audit Office report on UC entitled Early Progress. What it chiefly charted, 3 years after UC had been launched, was the lack of progress. The NAO detailed poor management, poor governance, poor financial control, and confusion among the suppliers building it, plus the continued absence 3 years into its creation of a detailed view of how universal credit is meant to work. It disclosed that, almost uniquely, the entire multi-billion programme had to be reset. In other words, almost, though not quite, started again. For some people at least, it didn't come as a total surprise. There are moments in your professional life that you remember vividly, and one of mine is picking up the original white paper in December 2010 that said that this would all be done and dusted by 2017 and thinking there is no way that is going to happen. And as I'm sure you all know, UC aims to replace 6 in and out of work benefits with 1, and if and when completed, it will affect 8 million households, millions more people, and roughly 1 in 3 of the working population, and will have to cope every month with 1.6 million changes of circumstance. A nice all-embracing phrase that is being anything from as simple as earning a bit more to earning a bit less, to losing a job, gaining a job, acquiring a new relationship which may and may not involve children, simply having a child, to separating, getting divorced, changing your housing, or being evicted. Leave aside the more complex cases around health and disability that enter into this equation. So it's no surprise that it proved a challenge, and it indeed remains a huge one. The timetable aside, much else went wrong, including making the senior responsible owner for UC also chief operating officer for the department's entire £160 billion business, a load that is doubtful if anyone could carry. The rush to get UC up and running meant that it started to be built way ahead of the detailed legislation being through. And in the words of David Pitchford, the then chief executive of the Major Projects Authority, who was part of the rescue operation, it was announced before it was planned, it was commenced before the end state was mapped out. I should point out that some of the facts around UC's history remain contested, so where the timetable came from is a matter of dispute. Ian Duncan-Smith, whose baby of course this was, insists the department gave him the timetable. Others seeing it as being heavily political, that he believes that if it was not up and running by the time of the 2015 election, then it risked being killed off. And there is some evidence for that second view. There were other issues. Francis Moore's insistence that government IT should be built using an agile approach rather than the more traditional waterfall one, where, to oversimplify the distinction, all of it gets built before any of it gets rolled out. The DWT and its suppliers struggled mightily with that, and with the original idea that all of this would be done online, security became a major issue. And the Treasury, for years and years, was at best highly sceptical about UC, quite rightly some might say, and at times downright hostile. There was much else. But if that was the picture 3 years in, we're now 3 years on from that. So what is more interesting, I hope, for this gathering, is what then happened to allow the turnaround. How did UC go from disaster to what appears to be recovery, even if there's a long way still to go and much still to solve? Well, first was a degree of outside intervention. RDS would date that back to an internal report that he commissioned, his so-called Red Team report, that landed in mid-2012. More obvious to outside eyes, perhaps, was the arrival first of the Major Projects Authority in January 2013, the first time it had been used to go in to rescue a failing project, followed by the arrival of Howard Shipley, the former construction overlord for the 2012 Olympics, as the project's fifth senior responsible owner. Now, purely in hindsight, and it certainly did not feel like this at the time, that looks more like one process than two. The outcome, after much blood on the floor, was a twin-track approach that used the limited original build of universal credit for the very simplest cases, that in fact provided some feedback for what in effect was a new, genuinely agile approach to building a second version of UC, the one that is just starting to be rolled out now and is intended to replace the first version. Interestingly, this is being built in-house by DWP rather than entirely contracted out. And insofar as it seems to be going okay, it corrects the mistake that was made across all of central government in the 1990s and 2000s, when the ability to do any IT other than write the contract in the first place was outsourced, including largely the ability to manage the contract when it was led. This new version has adopted a test and learn approach, using regular short-term feedback, not just from staff but also from claimants, to adapt the way the software and the program works as it gets built and goes along. And so for UC, it has allowed policy, operations and software development to be tied together in a way that did not happen before, where ministers and civil servants and even outsiders speak of a caste system or a hierarchy in the department, one where operations were not properly engaged with the policy development, with IT operating a place or two further down the table, below the salt, so to speak. Maintaining that test and learn approach as the new version starts to be rolled out at scale and takes on existing as well as new cases is just one of the many challenges that UC still faces. And since November 2015, and only as recently as November 2015, the Treasury now has a direct financial interest in UC succeeding. Up to that point, delays in UC were saving it money. So at that point, for the first time, and very late in the day, the interests of the DWP, the Cabinet Office, the Treasury, and Number 10 were all finally aligned. And it appears now to have stable leadership. And crucially, although completion, if it happens, will now be 5 years later than originally intended, UC finally appears to have a timetable that is realistic. It needn't, however, have taken what will be 12 years from its inception if implementation had been better designed and handled from the start. That's my summary.
Great, thanks Nick. And there's lots more. I encourage people to read the actual document. You'll find in those 40,000 words some real gems and insights into how government operates and how major projects like this have so much risk and inherent trouble in getting them through. But Emma, maybe over to you to talk through some of the lessons that we drew out in the context of the wider work that the Institute's done on implementation and how that happens in Whitehall.
Thanks, Julian. So, accompanying Nick's fantastic report on universal credit, the Institute for Government's published a short briefing paper that I think most of you have on the lessons of universal credit for current and future major projects in government. And I'm going to talk through some of those lessons now, but I want to begin with some background which is important for those lessons. Universal credit has attracted a lot of controversy over the years, often with good reason. But as Nick has said, and it's worth restating this, at its core, universal credit had the makings of a good idea. Benefit system simplification had enjoyed widespread political support for a long time. The complexity of the benefit system had created real problems for the people using it. At its worst, it took 169 questions just to establish a single parent had the right to access income support. The lack of join-up between different parts of the system meant that people who were struggling to get by could suddenly find they owed thousands of pounds in overpaid tax credits. Now, Nick's report shows that universal credit is probably still salvageable, although it isn't clear that it will achieve everything that it hoped to, and it shouldn't have been such a difficult journey. Universal credit isn't a one-off. At the moment, government has 53 transformation and service delivery projects in its portfolio. They're worth £116 billion together. It's got 36 ICT projects in the portfolio at the moment, worth some £16 billion. Now, many of these projects could be delivered even more effectively and efficiently by understanding why universal credit experienced the problems that it did and how they can be avoided in the future. So from the perspective of the Institute for Government, I want to pick out 5 lessons, and there's a possibility of a 6th, which I'll mention at the end. So the first lesson is don't skimp on planning for implementation. Universal credit was a huge change from the benefits system it sought to replace, but despite that scale of change, there was underinvestment in policy design and in policy planning. There was a failure, if you like, to sweat out what the end state of universal credit would look like. Even by 2013, there was still no Bible that set out detailed operational plans for universal credit. It also failed to really engage with the people using the benefits system, single parents, people looking for work, and people with long-term health conditions early enough to really understand how the system needed to work for them. The new, truly agile version of universal credit is using a test and learn approach, is taking regular feedback from claimants to adapt the software and the program, and as such it's far more responsive to the needs of users now. The second lesson is beware overload. The Department for Work and Pensions had 11 other major projects on its books at the same time as universal credit to begin with. All of those 11 projects, in addition to universal credit, involved major business change. But cuts at the top of the department meant that senior personnel in DWP were already stretched very thinly and couldn't always give, quite understandably, universal credit the time that it needed. Experienced project managers were also in short supply. Now, project management is an absolutely vital role in government, particularly when you have the projects portfolio that government has at the moment. Investments are being made in this. The Major Projects Leadership Academy is providing training for senior responsible owners, for those of you that don't know, the jargon for people in charge of big projects in government. But government needs to make sure that there's an adequate career path for project managers in government that rivals that of policymakers. The third lesson is create a culture for delivery. There were two different cultural challenges that we saw in universal credit that got in the way of delivering it effectively. First, the people who were making the policy were separated from those doing things like designing the software for universal credit or from working on delivery issues. The suppliers were in Warrington, the people working on the claimant commitment were in Sheffield, and the policy machine, as Nick said, was in Whitehall. But we know that policies succeed when those with technical and operational delivery expertise are involved right from the outset of the policy process, working hand in hand with policymakers. Now, this has again worked much better since the reset of universal credit, where the test and learn approach has been adopted, and as a result, the operations, software and policy elements have been tied much more closely together. And the second element to the cultural challenge was the no bad news culture that Nick's report brings out so well, a reluctance to always be honest when things weren't always on track. Now, of course, that's not unique to universal credit by any stretch, and senior leaders across the piece need to make sure they've got robust measures in place to avoid no bad news cultures. For ministers, this might mean reaching beyond formal accountability structures without sidelining them, understanding from people outside government how things really feel on the ground. The fourth lesson is to innovate, but to do it carefully. With stretched timelines and inadequate resourcing, it can of course be really attractive to replace the old way of doing things with a new technique, a new approach, a new technology. But big, high-profile projects aren't necessarily the best place for doing this, certainly not for doing it multiple times. In universal credit, greater attention should have been applied to adopting agile project management, something that the department had very little experience of. After the reset, agile is being done better with a proper plan. And finally, our fifth lesson would be build in resilience from the start. Universal credit has at various times been described as an unlucky project. It was certainly beset by a series of challenges, although how unique they were, I'm not sure. But in any case, successful projects have to be able to weather all sorts of challenges and changes in the internal and external context. And universal credit might have been less susceptible to some of that bad luck if it had had more resilience built in. So strategies for keeping senior staff in place, trying to have more consistency. At one point, it had 5 senior responsible owners in just over 3 years. Or if it had had more effective and earlier external challenge, and that's something that's hopefully been corrected now, given that the Infrastructure and Projects Authority is in a much stronger place than its predecessor, the Major Projects Authority that was just starting out in the earlier days of UC was. So those are simplified versions of the 5 lessons. I'd encourage you to read the briefing note in addition to Nick's report to hear more. They inevitably focus on the challenges universal credit experienced and what's been learnt from them. But as Nick has emphasised, universal credit is a story of challenges, but not necessarily of failure. And since the reset, it looks far more likely that come 2022, something like universal credit is going to emerge. And if it does, I think that can be our final lesson. Resets can work. There can be a lot of pressure on ministers to push on when a project is in trouble. Certainly, it's preferable to invest sufficiently in planning up front that resets aren't necessary. But when that hasn't happened, cancellation is not necessarily the only option. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. David, listening to all that, I'm sure there's some bits you'll recognise and some bits that you might think, well, have they really got that right? It's a fascinating journey. And the turnaround, I mean, the reason the Institute is so interested in this is you can write many, many stories about failure in government and actually well beyond government in these kind of change. But something that turns around and resets itself and gets itself back on track is actually quite rare. I was wondering your thoughts on what you've heard, but also maybe your thoughts more broadly on what lessons for government come out of your experiences around universal credit.
Okay, well, I mean, my background, as you said, is I worked for a long time in the business financial area and came in rather late in life. I'm now a thorough old age pensioner into this project, which we've been doing now since 2010. I think one of the things, clearly, it is enormously ambitious. And why does one do something quite as dramatic as this, is basically start and rebuild the entire welfare system? You could only do that because the legacy system had frankly reached the end of the road. It had been so complicated that it was so difficult to operate, it was so difficult to understand that you had to start again. Now that throws up, that decision throws a basic organisational problem up. And the problem is this: you have got an organisation in DWP that has been based around managing this sclerotic system, managing the tweaks, the problems. I mean, they actually do an incredible job of doing that, but that requires an entirely different skill set than the one required to build an entirely new system and to re-engineer from scratch. And so you need a lot of different and new resources to do that. And that is extraordinarily hard to do, certainly then, in a government context, when you're very circumscribed in the numbers of people you can bring in with those skills, which are inevitably rather expensive skills. And so you end up assembling teams based on the resources that you have available. And I think that is my number one lesson of all this, is look at how do you get the right team in. The other thing that hits me quite dramatically when I think about it is this organisation, DWP, and I suspect most large organisations, find it extraordinarily hard to work with something which is a concept, which doesn't exist. It needs to have something on the ground which it can start working with and seeing how it works in terms of what partners it needs to work with, what the claimants are doing, how its own organisation works. And I think that is an incredibly important thought, because it means it takes you, how do you introduce something a brand new? It means you've got to get something on the ground very, very quickly, which actually goes counter to some of the advice, get it all planned out beautifully. It actually says, no, don't, get something out quick, because then the organisation can see what it's dealing with. Nick made this point. I mean, the commissioning process that when I went in 2010, basically the IT department in DWP and in other government departments was a commissioning IT commissioning organisation, because the IT skills had been sent out to the organisations. And we discovered that that was simply wrong. You can't do IT development separate from ops. And we tried very hard in Warrington, because the ops people up there, external IT companies were there. But we ended up finding we had to bring it in and integrate it into one. And that is a big a big change for DWP, and indeed it will be for other government departments. So we had to rebuild our IT and how it operated within the organisation from scratch. It was a bit like replacing the train engine on the way from London to Birmingham. So we had to rebuild our organisation to be able to do that. And there are 3 areas of expertise which are scarce in our economy as a whole, which you need to really worry about having. And that is clearly IT in the sense of the data architecture, the software development, and all the different skills there. The second one is project management. And the third one is, I don't mean commissioning, I mean it's more important, the contract management. And those are 3 sets of skills, professional skills, very highly paid in the outside world, which you need to worry about having in place. One of the most interesting experiences, certainly of my life, was in 2012-2013, when we were designing the regulations that made universal credit. And we had, the whole department was working on this, and we had, I remember, 62 separate submissions come up of how we did at different areas of universal credit. And each one would have had roughly 5 different recommendations within it. So there are 300 decisions essentially to be made. And I remember we sat round the table, we called it the hard list process, and we sat round the table, my table, would have been about typically 12 people depending, everyone there, the ops people, the policy people, the legal people, the IT people, the political spads, everyone there, working on these conclusions. And it was amazing the number that we sent back to be revised, just to make sure the whole thing worked together and was coherent, because there were so many decisions. And I think that is an experience that I think people should think very hard about when they're trying to do something like this. The other thing is that some things you can go out and build, put a team out, send them outside government and go and build it, because they're pretty self-contained. When you're talking about something like universal credit, which, in a way it's at the heart of your society, the balance between the incentives you're trying to get people to do to manage their own lives and the safety net you're trying to provide, getting that balance, the political implications of that, the social implications of that, all of those things, they mean that you cannot send it out. It has to remain at the heart of your political process. And that means that your organisation has got to be able to do all of those things, and you can't get rid of it. I think the other thing that you find, as we went into this test and learn, we got the pathfinders, the live one, and then the digital one. We found things happened that we simply did not expect. Things that actually turn on your head, your whole way of doing it. And the example that I would use is we discovered that the claimants developed, they had a logbook with their work coaches, and suddenly the dialogue between the work coach and the claimant was going online on their smartphones. I'm off to look for a job now, or can I do that, or whatever. And so suddenly the whole pattern that we had of what the relationship at the heart of the system was changed, and we've had to test and learn out. So I think one of the things, is, what were we doing? In practice, what we had was a live system that had all the characteristics of universal credit, but was not interactive. And we learned a lot from that. That was what the live system was teaching us. And then the second system, the digital system, is when it became interactive as well. And I think if I was looking back, maybe if we'd been more explicit about separating those two things, we would have had a smoother ride. But that is one of the big lessons that I would take from it. And I think I just finally would close, the thing that I think the real reason that Nick calls it in recovery, the real reason it is going ahead, and it is because it works. And what is amazing is you go out round the job centres, and the enthusiasm of the job centre staff to have something that goes with the grain of what they're trying to achieve for the first time after being struggling with this legacy system. And these figures that we're getting out showing how much more motivated the claimants are, that is actually what has sustained it now as we drive it out. Because if we hadn't had that, it would have been much tougher to push through. So that, I think, is the reason. It actually does do what it said on the tin.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Thank you, David. So it works. You heard it here. Yeah. It is there and rolling forward. Denise, any thoughts, just thinking of the wider experience of these major projects? I mean, some of the stuff we're talking about presumably is quite common and ways of dealing with it, but some of it's quite particular, I think, to Whitehall and the public sector. Any thoughts on what we can do going forward to think about how we get ourselves on that path to things working quicker and with less pain?
Absolutely, and I should say this feels a little bit uncomfortable, doesn't it? It's like doing an autopsy on a live body, I think, at the moment. I think Nick kind of set that out at the start. We're not quite sure yet what the outcome is. So I'm just going to kind of preface with that, I suppose. The story resonates at a general and a specific level, and one of the things that I observe in the conversations I have around the Major Projects Association and in my role at the University of Leeds is that nobody ever sets out to fail. I have never bumped into anybody in a major project who has set out to fail. But if a number of factors come together, failure is almost inevitable. And that's so frustrating to see when people are trying to do a very good job. The other thing that I find is that when we hold a mirror up to major projects specifically, the challenges that we find tend to fall into 5 buckets, if you like, 5 areas, and they're to do with governance, requirements, organisational design, procurement and execution strategy. And I'm sorry if that sounds a bit jargony, for those of you who are sort of in the world of project management in the room, and I'll try to just bring that to life if I can. Because I think for lessons from the future, we do have to learn from the past, don't we? So in terms of governance, there are many themes throughout the report around how the governance could have been strengthened, things like the independence of the programme board, former chairman of the Major Projects Association in that role, Sir Robert Walmsley. So you'll see if you look at the programme that we've been doing across the world of major projects, there are many of those themes we've already been tackling. An independent review and challenge, I don't think you can overstate the importance of just having that ability to bring in an outside perspective. I think that was, and that resonates in this case. The term requirements I'm talking about being clear about what your end game is. And we heard right at the start from Nick around perhaps there wasn't that clarity from the start. Organisational design, you know, the issues around lack of co-location, if you like, and then that sort of the practicalities that then come with a lack of a one-team feeling sometimes is common again across major projects. And the overstretched capability and capacity is something which again we hear time and time again, not just in the public sector but in the private sector, and not just in the UK but globally, so that all resonates. In terms of procurement, there's a saying we hear often at our seminars, you get the supply chain that you deserve. So I think if the client isn't smart, isn't intelligent about being very, very clear about what they're expecting, you know, you will get what you deserve, and we've seen that time and time again. And then the final bucket, if you like, the execution strategy, what I'm talking about there is achievability of timetable, understanding of a new approach like agile, and the scale and complexity of all the interfaces that had to be managed. So had we been holding that mirror up, I think we'd have seen probably very, very similar things using the framework that I'm used to using. The particular point about a reset, if you like, rather than a cancellation, is again something we've talked about quite a lot at Major Projects Association seminars to sort of test the water across our public and private sector members. One of the resounding messages we get is that it takes real honesty and bravery to pause. You know, in a construction or infrastructure type project, which is my background, people will stop projects if they see a health and safety issue. You know, you'll go onto a site, something doesn't look safe, the project will be stopped. Doing that in a more kind of esoteric sense, if you like, takes quite a lot of guts, and people haven't always had the power to do that, and I do think it's incredibly important. And the big message from our membership is always, although it might feel difficult and uncomfortable, if it could be avoided by using early review points and early warning signs, then try do that. But if not, then do take that step and do reset if necessary. There's an interesting piece of work that IPA Global have done, and I'm sorry to introduce another IPA. We've got 2 MPAs already, and now we've got 2 IPAs, I know, but it's IPA Global, who are an independent organisation. And according to their work, major project failure is twice that of what you might call small projects. And what they found is that there are no semi-successful major projects. If they go wrong, they tend to fall apart and do that quite spectacularly. And I think that does sort of provide that further impetus for kind of pausing, resetting and reviewing with external challenge. So lessons for other projects, slightly being a bit more positive now. Sorry, that was all a bit negative. The focus on the front end, it's the subject of our annual conference this year. There's been report after report saying that projects that start badly never recover. There is in the world of project managers especially, that urge, if you like, an inherent urge to just get on and do something, to have something to see, to get your teeth into. But I think actually we'd really encourage you to just take time at the front end to make sure that you've set up the conditions for success. And when you're doing that, don't think you can focus just on one thing. You can't just focus on the technology or the people. You have to take a fully systemic approach. You have to recognise that interaction of the people, the technology, the systems, the work practices. There are tools that can help you do that, and just do that right at the start. A couple of other sort of general reflections for the other major projects, I suppose. This question of retrofitting benefits to match an imperative, or redefining value and exploiting the benefits, is something I don't think we've quite unpicked, and we can maybe just discuss as we go through the rest of the session. Do have to be absolutely clear what you're trying to strive for, but if there are benefits that come out as you're going along, make sure you do redefine to make the most of those. A bit of a bugbear of mine is around people not spending as much time on the design of the organisation as they do on the design of the asset or the service, and I think that's come out in all the observations we've heard so far. The organisation will not form itself. We'll end up with accidental kind of project management type arrangements. So do just take time on that organisational design. Get the policy and strategy right, and the public sector will deliver. I think the UK's now got a proven track record where the policy and strategy has been right. We have been able to deliver successfully. So I think we have to really reinforce that as much as we can. A couple of just, if I may, wider points which haven't come out in the report, but I think are good general messages for major projects that we observe and discuss regularly across our membership. One of them is around planning for transitioning. All major projects will transition. I know we're having a bit of a debate about agile versus waterfall and so on, but on a global, on a macro level, they will transition from policy into development, from development into implementation, operations and so on. Those transitions always take a lot longer than people expect. Different skills, a different organisational culture is required at those different phases, and that can't just happen overnight. So plan for your transitions. Another point for me is around valuing project controls as a means of earning trust and respect and building confidence. I think sometimes project controls are seen as a little bit constraining. They're trying to hold our project management capability back. I don't agree with that. I think if used appropriately, with the right evidence to underpin decision making, project controls can be absolutely vital in building that trust and confidence between the different parties. So conditions for success for me, alignment around a simply stated purpose. I think that resonates with what we've heard in the report. A fully systemic approach, especially right at the front end. Think about how everything interacts. Conceive of the system as a whole, improve it as a whole, manage it as a whole. And commitment, strong leadership and political consensus are absolutely vital. The thing I'm not going to say, which you might have thought I would have done, is that we need more project management training. I think what we actually need is better education of major project sponsors and clients. Not for complex major projects, more training. Just pause there.
Okay, thanks, Denise. And I think some very valuable sort of points on that. But I think, you know, as you said right at the start, nobody has set out in any of these, and I think it's always useful to have reports. There are not some bad people trying to break things, which sometimes these get reduced to. It's actually people trying to do very well in difficult and challenging situations and ways we can help ourselves. Jeffrey, on to you. I'm just interested, we've picked up a little bit about sort of planning and trying to get stuff, but get things on the ground, but also the political context of that. I mean, quite often in Whitehall, people will know, and if you don't seize the moment of political momentum, you may well fail to get anywhere in a very long time. Just thinking about your experiences inside government and outside, any thoughts and reflections, but also around that, and how do you successfully get projects up and running within the public sector?
Well, look, there is tension between successful delivery of projects and the political process, and you know, a lot of people try hard to get it right, but probably we still haven't quite got it right. So a political timetable will call for the start of the delivery of a project or the conclusion of a major scheme of re-engineering the public service at a time, and make that commitment at a time when actually officials don't really know how long it's going to take, and actually they could always do it longer. Because I think one of the things that's important is on any major undertaking, whether it's a major infrastructure project or a business change, you do have to spend a lot of time up front if you want to get it right. And if right means delivering to time, to budget and to specification, the longer you take up front, the better. Now, the Treasury has successfully delayed Crossrail for 20 years. And I can think of one former Second Permanent Secretary who regarded that as one of his greatest triumphs. But the consequence of that was that a lot of people knew an awful lot about Crossrail by the time they started to build it. So that actually the successful delivery of Crossrail reflects actually quite a lot of effort that's gone in up front. In the same way, the Olympics was not determined by politicians. If you think about it, the timetable was not driven by elected politicians. It was dictated by the IOC, who's actually done this, you know, every 4 years for a long time, knew how long it would take. So there was some element of reality introduced into the system early on. Now, look, I'm sympathetic to politicians as well as civil servants in this situation, because on the other hand, you know, it's very hard to go to the electorate and say, I want to spend a lot of money, and you'll see the benefits in 15 years' time. I recognise that is a challenge as well, but I do think this seems to be another example where these two things are slightly at loggerheads. And look, I'd give a current example. I think if there'd been more time to develop HS2, I think it would have been cheaper, largely because some of the pre-engineering that is actually can be done to lower cost and to bring this more into line with what it would cost to build this in France would have been possible. But on the other hand, would the political momentum have sustained a project through that development phase? And I think those are the questions that, look, I don't think we've got an answer to as to how we resolve them. Look, I do think there's a thing about IT projects. I mean, the thing about the public sector is they have got a lot of ambitions in IT, but they will have to be transparent when they fail or they get into difficulty. A lot of private sector organisations have similar problems with IT delivery, with business change, with checking whether the users can use it, and I do work for a bank. And the financial services sector has got some of these problems as well. But frankly, they don't have to admit it. Mr. Timmins will not be coming in to see the banking system in all its glory in the way that the NAO, Parliament and others look at these major infrastructure or these major IT projects. And look, if I look at IT projects, Peter Gershon, who's very good about this sort of stuff, about 10 or 15 years ago was constantly emphasizing a report that an American consultancy had produced of looking at all of the public and private sector schemes in the United States in IT that were delivered. Only 50% of them were successful in terms of delivering to time, to budget and to specification. Now, maybe it's got a bit better, but if we're going to be ambitious in this space, probably we have to build in an expectation of a degree of failure at the start. And that's probably a lesson for politics. Now, failure is not absolute, but failure is, it may not be to time, it may not be to budget, and may not quite get to where we want to go. And I think that is the nature of IT. Look, I think the other thing I'd comment about IT is, it is a very ideological thing. I have come across, in terms of the IT sector within government, a tendency towards ideological preference as to IT approaches. And to be honest, that's been there for about 15, 20 years. I mean, I think if I go back to some of the ideological preferences behind some very major healthcare ITs about 10 or 15 years ago, which also didn't go particularly well, there is that in this sector of technology, which is probably something to avoid in major projects going ahead. So there's, you know, if I go back 15 years, government was learning then the issues of not actually building a system driven by what the users can take advantage of, not taking account of business change integrated part of an IT transformation project. In fact, the government abandoned PFI as an approach to IT projects because those two things were a problem. So I think the slightly worrying thing is that probably the public sector has known about the problems that have faced this particular project for quite some time, and it may be the case we haven't quite learnt how to sort of handle them properly, and that's within the public sector. Look, I'll echo one big thing that's been said: sponsor capability. Look, it's undoubtedly the case government's outsourced far too much. It's outsourced client capability in many places, and it hasn't got client capability of the right calibre to manage contracts once they're in place, and in terms of new major projects. Now, in infrastructure, it's interesting to see where success has happened and why, and it can't happen throughout public sector procurement. So I understand that there are limitations to this, but in Crossrail, a separate organisation with a separate board, with a separate approach to pay, conditions and management, has actually delivered a successful scheme in exactly the same way as the Olympics, but within the public sector. So, I mean, that is creating a client capability from scratch in those areas, very significant client capability, and not seeking to outsource it to a third party. And I do think in IT, a real important lesson is every government department has to have its own IT capability that's credible, as well as a business change capability that's credible. And look, I'd say that for every government department that's got a major IT programme, I think we have to be a bit careful about what the centre can achieve, whether it's the Cabinet Office or the Treasury. Look, the Treasury's there just to make sure people spend the money appropriately that they've got and to stop them spending any more. It's not there to ensure delivery of a service, and it doesn't think like that. In the same way as the Cabinet Office is principally there to keep track of what's happening and also to inform senior ministers if something's going wrong. I mean, what we can't see, I think, we can't expect them to do too much in terms of replacing the responsibilities and what departments need to do and need to be equipped to do, particularly if you've got an accounting officer system that keeps departments and their permanent secretaries primarily responsible for the expenditure of money. So I think the centre is really important. It's really early warning signal. I think assurance is there to be done up front, probably to be less active after the initiation of a project with a proper setup of the arrangement. Yes, information, I think, is a problem in government. I think it's really difficult sometimes for civil servants to prioritise commercial and technical truth in their submissions they're dealing with public policy to ministers. I mean, you may regard that as slightly malevolent, and sometimes it can occasionally be, but more often than not, it's actually a difficulty with the generalist nature of the civil service in actually de-emphasising in quite a subtle way some of the hard realities in commercial delivery of major schemes that the people who are actually on the coalface feel. And so sometimes that gets just faded out of the submissions and the advice that ministers get. So it is common for ministers to be surprised in the end as to what's really happening on the ground. And I have seen that across Whitehall over about 20 years. So I don't think it's unique. And I think that gets me to my final point. Actually, there is a problem here with the civil service. The civil service is great. The generalist ethos has got a huge amount going for it. But what it hasn't been able to do yet is to adapt a specialist ethos where it needs to, which actually delivers what I'd call a single market for delivery. A single market for delivery means people come and go, public, private. On the delivery side of this equation, there's not a huge gap in terms of pay differentials. And actually the best that's in Britain is available to ministers and the public sector to deliver the ambitious schemes which we rightly have, whether it's in IT or infrastructure. And look, we haven't got that right. And you know, it's quite hard to see how to get there in a way that's publicly acceptable with the sort of salaries that are paid. We improvise, I think, increasingly by setting up delivery bodies that do that, but do it slightly at arm's length so that people can, you know, feel it's justifiable to pay people properly to do this job. And of course, bringing people in who then have careers elsewhere also provides the career for delivery for those specialists in a way which actually I don't think the civil service currently constituted is geared up to do. So look, you know, reform the civil service. I mean, I remember sitting with Baroness Videra in the middle 2000s, where she had already decided that the only way of actually making progress in delivery was reform of the civil service, but also saying, well, it's pointless, we'll never succeed, so why bother? I do think that is, in this area, a really important step if you want to make a system change.
Thank you, Geoffrey. You'll find that the Institute for Government does not agree with the "it's pointless, one can never succeed" attitude in these sort of things. But some really, really useful and insightful points there from Geoffrey and from the rest of the panel. I want to now just throw this open to questions and comments from the audience. You've heard a lot of things, a lot of themes running through about specifics of IT, about the approach to big projects, about the interface between politics, timetabling and delivery. Just really interested in questions, thoughts for the panel, or comments from people who've been involved in this. If you can make questions thinking about the future rather than taking us into issues of determining the past, that would be brilliant, but feel free to ask whatever you like. I'll just start down here with this gentleman here and then work our way through. I'll take questions in batches if people want to.
I'm Kirkwood, and I'm from the House of Lords, and I spent...
you could use the microphone.
Do I need to use the microphone?
Yeah, thank you.
I spent the afternoon reading 30,000 of the 40,000 words, and I think it should be turned into a screenplay, and if Nick can persuade Benedict Cumberbatch to play IDS, then I will be at the premiere. I want to get 2 points, really. Firstly, to Emma, there's a very obvious... I've been involved in the parliamentary parts of all of this, and an obvious lesson for me is that this legislation would not have succeeded without David Freud staying in the position he's been in. Now, that's special to him because he's got talent, and he does it for nothing, and no one else will do the job. But I am absolutely certain that one of the conclusions that the Institute should take from this is the importance of seeing all the way through, from beginning to end, a single minister. And every opportunity should be taken to say that. But the second point is that I think that Parliament gets left out after the legislation is passed, in spite of David Freud's obvious frustration that he could not share some of these implementation issues with us. We had a masterclass in the committee stage of the 2012 Act. It was the best piece of committee stage work that I've been involved in 35 years in public life. And therefore, the ministerial team had the confidence of certainly the House of Lords, and I am absolutely certain myself, it may sound naive, that there could have been a parliamentary dimension to some of the troubles that beset the implementation, which could have been considered in a grown-up way by maybe a joint committee of both houses or whatever. I think it's absolutely senseless to have arguments about agile versus waterfall behind closed doors and nobody can tell tales out of school. Obviously there are commercial sensitivities, obviously there's the NAO and the PAC and the Select Committee in the Commons, but I can tell you, because I know Anne Begg told me that she was immensely frustrated, along with others, that we knew that there was trouble at Mill, but we all had to subscribe to Computer Weekly magazines to find out what was going on. And I don't think that's a sensible way to treat Parliament. So my suggestion is we need to, and I was interested in some of the things that Geoffrey was saying about the tension. There is a tension, but it can be handled, and it can be handled better. And I think the Institute should think a bit more clearly about that.
That's great, thank you. Just before I get Emma to come back, just take a couple more questions. I think there's a gentleman just there.
Thank you very much. Roger Southam. I sit on the Administrative Burdens Board for HMRC and got involved with Universal Credit off the back of that. Firstly, as a comment, there was a lot of people put a lot of time in from external organisations, including ABAB and HMRC, etc., and small organisations, where we were going in meeting monthly, and at best it felt like we were being ignored because the issues being raised and the challenges being put forward were in the too difficult category. It wasn't quite fitting where it was going. So when you're raising issues over a universal credit that's going to be flat across a year, and you have farmers who have seasonal peaks of income and then no income over a period of time, how's that going to work? It was kind of in the too difficult category, so we'll come to that at a later date. And I think there could have been more openness, I think there could have been more engagement in an open way to actually want to solve problems from the start, and I think that would have helped the process. The other comment I'd make, which I still find utterly bizarre, but DWP have a different definition of self-employed to HMRC. I don't know how we can have the same word with two definitions. Surely you make up another word for the second definition. You don't give it the same word. So there's a whole level of practicality that sits within DWP, I believe, where there needs to be either a change or there needs to be a realization that you can't have a word with different definitions. If you're going to have different definitions on motor expenses, for goodness sake, tell people what the implications are and which will work for HMRC and which won't work. You can't keep doing things that people find out further down the line it's not what they thought it was.
Right, thank you. And then one more gentleman just over there for first round.
Thank you, Devon Galani, the Director of Policy and Practice. A comment and a question. So kicking off with a comment, we're doing a lot of work right now. Having been involved in universal credit from the outset, it's really interesting to see how practitioner views are changing. So as we're working with local authority, basically people who are administering the system as it is now, you're starting to see a majority now accepting the fact that this is happening and starting to really, I guess, starting to work with the grain of change. So I think that sort of reflects one of the conclusions of the report, is that it does seem to be back on track and gaining momentum, at least from anecdotally from what I'm picking up. I think the question is how we continue to make it continue to be more on track, more aligned with the original objectives and aims of universal credit. And there is it sort of came up in what I was able to read of the report this morning, which is that the sense of we are caught in a system right now that is used to complexity, used to being very highly targeted. There is a trade-off there around having a complex system that can be very precise to a particular set of circumstances, and that completely ignores the value of simplicity and having a coherent and straightforward system. And I think one of the challenges universal credit will continue to have, and government policy generally, will be to continue to move in that sort of valuing that simplicity and continuing to move in that direction. I think it'd be really helpful to get a comment from the team that universal credit, as it's rolled out, successfully as it looks like it is being now, how that continues and how we maintain that, so we're not having a similar debate 10, 15 years from now, because I think that would be a real shame.
Excellent, thank you very much, great questions. Just Emma, do you want to come back first off? But I think there was a wider theme on openness, not just Parliament, but a broader sense of government departments reaching out, which maybe a couple of members of the panel might want to pick up. And then I'll just maybe touch on some of the technical details before coming to the last question, David, with the don't get into a definition of self-employed, please. And then that valuing simplicity, how do we keep that motoring and take out some of the complexity that bedevils some of these systems that accretes itself? Emma, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, I'll just come up in on the point about ministers. I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the real strengths of universal credit has been Lord Freud's role and that longevity, a minister actually sticking with a project right through from conception to delivery. And I think really that kind of ties into a wider argument about the role of ministers in the policy process. I think the role of ministers in ideas development and kind of initial policy design, launching a project, tends to be heavily emphasised. Something that the Institute's tried to focus on, and indeed we'd like to do more on, is what is the role of ministers in delivery? We think they have a very important role, actually. I've already mentioned the kind of unique opportunity ministers have for reaching outside departments, understanding how things are operating on the ground, also just keeping momentum behind a project. Many of these kind of major transformational changes take many years and can quickly lose momentum, and actually keeping a political champion with a project can help overcome that. I think there's a kind of broader point about longevity as well, which is not just about ministers, but also about senior officials. We've already talked about the fact that senior responsible owners on universal credit changed many times, and I think that Whitehall can still at times suffer from a high level of turnover at the official level too, and those projects which succeed are those where you see an SRO stick with a project again from start to finish, rather than seeing lots of chopping and changing. I think the challenge is, how do you incentivise people to stay with projects when often career development in Whitehall involves having to move relatively regularly?
Dave, do you want to pick up on the point about the interaction with Parliament, possibly from your viewpoint on it? How did it feel to you? Has it matured? Is this something that we could do more, have a more mature relationship going forward on these major projects?
One of the most interesting events, and Archie will remember this, was when we announced in 2013 a delay, that we were resetting effectively the plan. And the contrast between Ian did it in the Commons, that statement, and I did it in the Lords. And Ian was basically, it was like a bear being attacked by wolves in the Commons. Very political, very aggressive, very unpleasant to watch, actually. And the contrast was when I did it in the Lords, I had a lot of really perceptive and indeed even supportive questions from right round the political spectrum. It was an entirely different process, and I think it's a difference between a group of politicians and a group in the Lords, clearly, who are more expert. And I think there is something there that when we think of big projects, who do you want to monitor it, which takes it away from the kind of the very aggressive political context. And it may be there's a role there in the Lords. It's actually, I've wanted to keep the Lords more informed, but you can't make statements in one house without making them in the other, so it's quite difficult to do without, and you can imagine the resistance of going into that bear pit. And I think there's one other thing that you need to think about. I mean, Archie's very polite, very, very complimentary to me, which of course I blushed with pleasure when he said, but there is something about having a user specifier who understands a system in detail and specifies it all the way through consistently, who is also publicly accountable. And I think there's a role there that we ought to think about very hard about institutionalizing, because if you don't have that, if the person is not publicly accountable or not really specifying in the interests of the users, you will have a breakdown, and he's got to stay there the whole time. So there is a role there in these projects, which I think should almost, I mean, you know, the SRO is a slightly different role, so I think, you know, and in perforce he has to, there's one here today, just down there, who actually has to sit in that position, but it's actually a specific role. And I mean, and one of the things that, I mean, I was deeply hurt by Roger, obviously. I mean, one of the things that made this system work was actually that David Gork at the Treasury and I formed a really very close relationship, and we could not have got this far with that without those two departments represented by those two individuals working together all the way through to make sure that the... Oh, right, okay. Sorry, I misheard you then. Yeah.
No, I never mentioned HMRC.
Yeah. Okay. I take it back.
Okay,
Good. Not a personal attack anyway, Roger. Anyway, and then finishing up, I think one of the things that Devon asked was about how do you keep it going on. And one of the things we have, which we have never had in the past, which therefore is a unique opportunity, is for the first time we can control and watch all the parameters of what someone who is a claimant is actually receiving. And we can monitor that very cheaply. And that means we can do randomized controlled trials to understand what actually works in our benefit system from the claimant point of view and motivates people to do the behaviors that we want. And that means, once we have this core architecture in universal credit, we can then start to move it, reflecting how we find people change behavior. And that is an immensely powerful tool of getting things to constantly improve.
I think that sort of cultural change, we talk about it sometimes in that agile to water flow sort of element of things, but having worked on benefits over many, many years, the accretion of complexity, if you can get a mindset change that starts with the user, would be a fantastic outcome beyond any IT system or anything like that we could bring into our welfare system. Picking up just, Geoffrey, Denise, on the other questions. I mean, openness, Geoffrey, you were responsible for publishing various open lists of infrastructure and things like that in Treasury, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
And things. How far do you think we can go on being open about projects and how they're operating and having real conversations rather than some kind of slightly slapstick version of public debate around these issues?
Well, look, I mean, what you can be open about is what your intentions are and some facts that, in the case of infrastructure, for example, actually inform investors, lenders, contractors, suppliers in their business plans and actually lead to efficiency. So you can say government is capable of saying, here is what's going to happen in the infrastructure market in the UK for the next 5 years. In the context of spending review commitments that are made, in the context of regulatory settlements that are going to be made. And that clearly is a benefit to the market in terms of transparency that will lead to efficiency. Would I have been delighted to have the negotiation of Hinkley Point C reported to Parliament on a regular basis? The answer is no. And is that and partly for that, and part of the reasons for that is any transaction of that sort that involves a commercial negotiation. I think transparency could lead to a poor outcome. Now you can debate whether it's a poor outcome or not at the moment, but that's irrelevant to the fact if you're having a commercial negotiation. If there is a process that involves a lot of commercial engagement, I think it's very difficult to be open until the conclusion of that process. And a lot of what government does involves that degree of commerciality. And I think also, I think some of the institutions that previously provided more impartial analysis have become slightly politicised. I would be concerned about the National Audit Office in terms of how it approaches some of its reports, where it seems to be becoming more interested in the press release than in some of the facts, and of course that is serving and has served certainly in the last Parliament, quite a combative political approach to looking at major projects. So I think it would be, the question I've ended up thinking is, are there intermediary institutions that can actually be involved in terms of looking at the facts in a way that is not slanted to a particular political agenda. And it'd be great to see them, but I can't find them when it comes to some of these issues. But on the other hand, I also know that House of the Commons, if you show any sign of weakness, I think as obviously happened in the occasion remarked before, if you give information, you'll be torn apart, and that itself can actually lead to problems in actually delivering a successful project, because it provides handicaps to good solutions. So I'm afraid I don't think you can be completely open in our political system until commercial negotiations are complete, and if it's not in the interest of actually taking forward a successful project.
Okay, thank you. Denise, you.
All I would really add to that is that we've been offering a briefing for politicians across all parties for the last couple of years for when they bump into the world of major projects, before that happens, when they're in the sort of live firing line scenario. Because one of the things we found is that people speak very different languages. So investors, bankers speak a different language, we found, to politicians, to those in the day in, day out world of major projects, to end users. And that language can be a common barrier. We just heard the one specific example of a definition of self-employment, which I'm not going to go anywhere near, let's be absolutely clear. But we hear sort of similar examples across the world of major projects. So taking that into then realms of things like reporting and transparency, it's common now for ratings of major projects in their early stages to be published as being red, and that causes quite a lot of consternation. That actually a major complex project in its very earliest stage, by its nature, has a lot of uncertainty associated with it. And if it wasn't being flagged as needing attention and care and special handling, I think that would give more people cause for concern. So I think for me, there's that kind of education, going back to the point of education around language, what's important to different people, and just really trying to spend more time teasing that out.
So thank you. Nick, do you have any thoughts on this today before I go back to another round of questions?
No, I was just reflecting on the comment over there about simplicity and it's a straight trade-off, isn't there, between simplification and rough justice. I mean, the simpler it is, the more there'll be rough justice. The more complex it is, the more you can attune it to individual needs, and that's just a tension that runs through the whole of the design of social security policy. And it's there are moments when it's affected UC, when something's been terribly simple, you say, well, actually that produces too rough a result, so you've got to amend it. So you're always changing it as you go along, and it tends to get more complicated. But I do think the point that you partly made, that the more you listen to what it feels like for the claimant at the other end, the chances are finding a way that has, that gets you a fairer result without making everything too complicated, which I think is what can happen at the moment. And I mean, I do think I don't know what the answer is to sort of longevity of oversight of these things, because government for ages, the government itself for ages, all colours have been saying we need senior responsible owners who stick with these projects all the way through, and it'd be good to have long-term ministerial oversight. And the examples where that happens are hellishly rare. I can think of very, very few where that's been true. So it's sort of an ideal that seems to be unattainable. I mean, interesting, the DWP did have one with Job Centre Plus, where Lee Lewis, who went on to be permanent secretary, was responsible for that. But that was a sort of 4 or 5 year programme. And that's quite long. If some of these things are going to take longer than that, I have no idea what the mechanism is that leads to continued, sustained ministerial and SRO oversight. It seems to be a sort of bit of a pipe dream. I mean, it's not a good idea, it's how you achieve it.
So thanks on that. Almost a question there from Nick. Anyone with answers to that from the audience, very welcome. But other questions and thoughts, including people from next door if they want to pop in as well. Gentleman there.
Thank you. My name's Matthew Trimming. I work for a number of IT firms, some of them delivering major projects, IT-enabled projects. Most recently, I was the advisor to the Treasury on digital during the spending review, looking at some of the cross-cutting investments that ended up with the GDS being given the budget that they've been given. So my question, having had a quick read of Nick's work, you talk about the role of GDS on the Government Digital Service on a number of occasions. And I'm just interested in people's perspective of what is the role of the centre in the future of universal credit, and more broadly on major projects across government, because I think we're at an interesting tipping point here. There is an argument to say that universal credit is GDS's biggest success. actually, that without the arrival of that sort of capability at the centre of government, you wouldn't have had the challenge to have the reset in 2013 and that move to sort of agile working, and two phrases that are sort of posters, quite literally, in their organisation: user-centred design and show the thing. Lord Freud's point about getting something on the ground early are things that clearly would benefit any major project, including universal credit. So just interested in the panel's thoughts on that.
Thank you. While people mull that question, I'll go to the gentleman there and then the lady here.
My name's Roy Sainsbury from the University of York. Like many here, I've been a sort of student of universal credit from the outset and followed its progress with great interest. I'm not quite sure I've got a question or comment or what, but some thoughts forming in my mind while I've been listening is that we've been hearing a story from disaster to recovery, but it's been the story of implementation of the technical aspects of universal credit. And I think there's another parallel story that's sort of missing, and not from Nick's account, it's certainly in there. It's the policy narrative, because we've been talking about the delivery of universal credit that was started in 2010, and I'm utterly confident now in 2020 we'll get it. Particularly because all the right government departments seem to be pushing in the right direction. And that's a major triumph. We will get universal credit. But what universal credit will we get? Because the policy story is one of retrenchment, salami slicing, and the universal credit we might get with poor incentives probably, because of the way the tapers have been reduced and the disregards and some being abolished altogether for young people, for example. And my fear is we're going to get a universal credit in 2022, but it's not the universal credit that we really wanted, and I know that possibly politicians wanted as well. And we may find that we deliver something in 2022 which, you know, it's the old cliche of the operation was successful, but, you know, the patient died. And I just wonder whether the sacrifices that you've made, politicians have made along the way, in giving up some of the tapers and disregards, which are already not as the ones you wanted in the first place, I know that. How much has that been part of the story of keeping the whole implementation story going? And is there a hope that we can recover some of the real promise of universal credit, which was to make work so much better than benefits?
That's great. And then just lady in the front, and then I'll take one or two more quick comments before we go back to the panel.
Thank you. Claire Pelham. A while ago back in history, I was SRO for a major IT project that was commended by the NAO. I remember slightly tediously starting every programme board and every submission with Peter Gershen's 6 lessons about why major IT projects fail. They're practically identical to the ones here, which really makes me wonder quite how good we are at learning lessons. And so picking up your challenge of let's look forward, I wanted to ask David about if he were starting again now, what is it that he wished he'd learnt then and that his senior officials had learnt that would have made things go better?
Great, thank you. Good question. Just gentleman beside you, and
then similar sort of vein. David Bicknell from Government Computing. By the way, Nick, great report, riveting read, as they say. And I appreciate the lessons you pulled out, Emma, but we have had these reports before and the same problems occur. So what makes you think it'll be different next time round? Could there be another universal credit? I worry a bit about ESN, the Emergency Services Mobile Communications Programme. Ambitious timescales, technically challenging, and the Home Office is adamant it will be delivered on time. And it may be right. So how do we ensure that the lessons you've rightly picked out from UC are learned and applied?
Okay, right. Thank you. And then Sue. Sue, can you just, microphone coming your direction.
Sorry. Just on the point Nick was making about people moving on and not having somebody who's in charge from start to finish, seems to me there's no earthly reason why people in the public sector and the private sector are ever going to be any different, and that most of them, and particularly good people, are going to want to move on, find more money, more challenges, just get a bit bored. Sometimes they retire, sometimes they die. and that what you need is, well, they do. I mean, it can cause chaos when somebody dies in midstream, as it were. Perhaps what people have got to look for is some kind of group, possibly, or who will take the project forward, and when one of them, perhaps it might be the boss, but when he or she goes, there are other people who have got institutional memory. You might even have somebody in this group, I'm not suggesting it should be a giant committee, somebody in this group whose job is to keep an institutional memory of the project, which can be passed on and written down.
That's great, thank you, Sue. So quite a few sort of bits there. David, I fear I'll drop you slightly here. GDS, greatest success is universal credit. How did it feel from the DWP viewpoint there? The policy questions, will it, in the end of the day, be worth it? You may or may not feel that. I'm sure your answer is probably yes, it will be worth it, but there may be some things and nuances in there that you might want to pick up on. And just sort of thinking about the lessons that Claire picked out. What are the things you wish you knew, and will we really learn it, or are we just going through another motion here in sort of recycling the same lessons but never really getting to the heart of it?
Okay, well, I mean, I know Nick describes a pretty gritty process, but on balance, I think GDS did save the programme, in the sense that Tom Loosemore in particular produced a really good data architecture, and the point about that data architecture was that it was secure. So GCHQ went through it, they kept, we'd involved them very early, and we could build on that. Now, that's oversimplifying what is an enormously complicated process of pulling that digital system into the major systems that we operate and have to operate in a big department. So it's not an easy process, but they did turn us into one that was workable over the timescales that we have got. Roy clearly, I mean, is pointing out about the reductions in the benefits, but the core proposition is that the architecture is there. With the tapers, we actually held on to the tapers. We lost some of the work allowances. And as I said before, once you have your core architecture in place, the country has a vehicle which it can adjust to represent where it wants to be politically in terms of what level it wants to pay people, and it can also test what the incentivization effects of different aspects are. So we have got what we wanted, and future generations will be able to use that. Claire's question is, I think the big thing we should have done, and we ended up ironically doing, was we should have realized we were doing two things. We were creating the structure of a benefit, the financial returns with the taper, and we were creating an interactive system so that people could respond the whole time. And I think what we ended up doing, of course, is separating those two, one in the live, one in the digital. And in practice, we should have gone with, an old-fashioned legacy-style system which did what Universal Credit is trying to do for people, and then start learning from it. And if we'd thought that through from the beginning, we wouldn't have had the difficult process of getting to that point through 2013. So that's the big, regret. But I think it's an interesting one for other programs. David's point: how will the lessons be learned? I mean, that's up to the Institute of Government to, get on out there, get out there and sell. And on Sue's final point, I mean, one of the things that gives me personally confidence that this is going to work is that the organisation as a whole, DWP, has now absorbed this new. It understands how it works, it can do it. The team happens to be competent, but that team operates within an overall organisational context. So, you know, that gives it enormous strength, and I think it is only quite recently that those two factors have come together, that you can feel confident that the programme has kind of got a bed, if you like, which will allow it to go forward safely.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Geoffrey, this question of can Whitehall really learn from these lessons? You were slightly sceptical, I think, in your opening remarks. Is there anything do you think we're getting better over time at running big projects? It's just it takes us a long time to learn, or are we actually just
we are better, and we're more confident. I mean, there was talk about this being a very ambitious scheme. I mean, the interesting thing is, I don't think in infrastructure or some of these other business change schemes go back 20 years, there would have been the confidence in the UK, either in the public sector, maybe even in the private sector, to take some things that we're doing now forward. And we should be pleased about that. We should be, pleased that we can be as ambitious as we are. And so I think that's good. But look, the corporate memory problem in Whitehall is, if people move jobs every 2.5 years into very different jobs, and they go around the system, both centre and in departments, look, there just isn't an ability to retain corporate memory. So, I'll give you one practical example. I'm not saying there's going to be a great PFI programme, but I can tell you that in looking at that 18 months ago, and this is not that long ago we were doing PFI, there is no capability left in Whitehall, apart from one department possibly, to actually effectively deliver a programme in terms of procurement ability. Now, the memory's gone. Memory's gone already. And I think it is true that Peter Gershon did itemise exactly how IT projects should be taken forward. And it's also true that, that's history in terms of understanding of what happened in that time or other. And I think what happens in other organisations is, yes, the boss moves on, dies, or whatever else, but frankly, it's a team with people who've actually worked with that that business or that particular type of activity, and have worked their way up to take over from that boss as they move on, and a boss will be there 4 or 5 years' time, possibly in a way that is not quite true in the Seals to Service. So, look, there are merits in the generalist approach. There are merits in this rotation system in terms of a lot of aspects of policy. There are not when it comes to delivery, and how you combine an approach that actually gives us strong capability in delivery, as well as the policy and political advice that we do well at civil service level. I think that's still a challenge. But certainly the corporate memory isn't there. It sort of disappears every 18 months in most departments, in most situations.
Right. Thank you, Geoffrey. And Denise, thinking about, this major projects occur across a lot of sectors. How do other sectors deal with this? Is it just simply we don't pay enough? Are there other ways for us to actually sort of get to the bottom of the retention and the reducing the churn that Sue talks about?
I think there's churn across all of the member organisations that we have. We have about 100 member organisations across all sectors and all parts of the supply chain, and it's something that we talk about a lot. And in fact, some of our member organisations almost use us as the corporate memory, if you like. We have reports going back 35 years unpicking the lessons from all of the major projects, and very much sort of recognising that you do get people moving around, moving between different organisations and having different experiences. That's been, our core purpose has been to improve the initiation and delivery of major projects by encouraging our members to share those experiences, capture those and record them and press on. There is a sort of challenge in human nature though, isn't there? Howard's a board member of ours and chairs some of our seminars, and we've talked quite frequently around this kind of human nature aspect of learning more from our own failures than from the success of others. And there's a view from some some people that they'll only kind of learn if they've experienced some of that pain for themselves, which we do try to save them from as far as we can, but it comes up time and time again. A way around that, possibly, I've talked at the start about those buckets that problems fall into, whatever type of major project you have. So we encourage people to hold the mirror up, look in that mirror honestly, get some peer review, some peer challenge to help them do that where necessary. And if you find that you've not got the capability to match the complexity you're facing, if you're not match fit, get help fast. There are lots of people who will come and support you through those really difficult times.
Excellent. Thank you, Denise. Emma, I'll come to Nick for the final word, but Emma, the Institute is going to sort all these problems. You care to tell us how?
I was actually first going to pick up on the comment about the role of the centre. GDS has been mentioned, but I think there's another institution at the centre that is also worth mentioning, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, which is there to oversee the major projects portfolio. And I think there are two things that it can focus on, indeed that it's already focusing on, and that would really help some of these lessons get learned. The first is really on project initiation and making sure that those involved in operational delivery are fully engaged in that kind of policy development and project initiation process. I think the other is about the type of projects that we're starting to see take up larger and larger part of the portfolio. Of course, infrastructure is still there, but service transformation is an increasingly large part of the portfolio, and as such, I think the emphasis should be on the IPA to help oversee the development of strong enough service transformation skills in government. And so I think those are two important things that the IPA can pick up. In terms of learning the lessons, I think, I think some of the lessons are starting to be learned. The IPA is a much stronger institution than the very early version of the MPA that existed when universal credit was starting out. Nick's mentioned the development of IT capability again in DWP. That puts it in a stronger place now than it was for much of universal credit. So I think some of these lessons are starting to be learned. Others we know are still there. I'm not convinced that the good news culture has changed dramatically in Whitehall, and I think that tension between political imperatives and good delivery, it does not have a simple solution. I think the Institute will carry on talking about the lessons, and I hope that government will listen as it often does.
Nick, do you want to finish us up on any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to pick up Roy's point in the sense that, because it's an IFG report, it's trying to look at implementation more than the merits of the policy. But it's clear the policy isn't quite what it was before. I mean, it's going to cost a lot less than originally intended, so it's much meaner. And also, if it's 6 years away from delivery, it must be itself be vulnerable to further policy change. I mean, there's just been a bit of a slowdown because there was change in a little while back, limiting tax credits to 2 kids and taking housing benefit away from. So you get other changes for other reasons that have an impact on universal credit, which will make it rather different by the end to what it started out as being. But I do think there is merit in the fact, and I think it's one of the few pieces of legislation where I've ever seen this, it has, built into the legislation is the ability to experiment. So there is some truth in the fact that this is a framework which different governments could do different things with. And that's a big plus, I think. I mean, just as an early part of the design, one of the good things that happened.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. We've covered a lot of ground there. A lot of challenges met, resolved, turned around. A lot of challenges still in place going forward for us and everyone in this room to deal with. The one thing I can add from the Institute is, I think when we're rolled out fully, 2022 or roughly around then, we will be throwing a big success party for universal credit and all those involved in it. So put it in your diaries now. And with that, just love to thank the panel for being so frank and open in this. And please do go and read Nick's report. There's some real gems in there. And if people would like to join us for drinks outside and continue the discussion, very welcome.